Okay.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this session of the Israel Dialogues. We started off at the beginning of the month with Professor Zhi Zhangzhan from Tsinghua University in Beijing, who introduced us to some of the complexities of China's relations with countries of the Middle East. And it was our good fortune to be able to get a Chinese perspective on what they have been doing, what they are doing, and some thoughts about the future of China, Middle East, with a special attention, of course, to Israel and Chinese-Israel relations. That was followed last week with Aaron David Miller from the Carnegie Endowment in the United States, with a marvelous overview and then a deep analysis of American foreign policy towards the Middle East as a region, concluding with some very thoughtful ideas and analysis having to do with U.S.-Israel relations. Today, we have the good fortune of having a friend join us, Professor Gabi Ben-Dor from Haifa University, well known to many across the country and especially to Holy Blossom. And it's a great pleasure to have Gabi with us. It always is, because he brings such knowledge and breadth of understanding of the complexities of the Middle East and the situation in which Israel finds itself, both in terms of its role in the region and the challenges and constraints and pressures it faces in the region, as well as Israel's position in the broader international community, and occasionally even some commentary about Canada-Israel relations. For today, my colleague Mark Anshin is going to moderate the session. So let me turn this session over to Mark, and he will introduce Gabi.
Thank you, David, and welcome to everybody today. Thank you for joining us. We're indeed, as David indicated, very privileged and honored to have with us our dear friend, Gabi Ben-Dor, Professor Ben-Dor from Haifa University, to be with us for the next hour and a half. And as David indicated, he's well known to everyone at Holy Blossom. He is our annual lecturer for the Posen lectures every year. We're looking forward to having him back again this year. He's every year comes to us with really quite insightful and incredibly analytical presentations on current situations facing Israel. So we're looking forward to that again. But today we also have a special treat. Today, Gabi is going to be with us and talking about changing conceptions of national security in Israel, sort of a very timely topic, given the changing dynamics occurring in the Middle East, particularly over the last year and a half since the Abraham Accords. So I don't want to spend any more time introducing Gabi. He's known to everybody. I would just want to get into it. Our format today will be that Gabi will present for about 35 minutes, a presentation. He has a very comprehensive presentation, followed by some questions by our panel. And then we'll open it up, hopefully, if the time permits, to questions from all of you. So with that, I turn it over to you, Gabi, and welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, very much. Let me try and share. Okay, real pleasure to be here with you. Looking forward to 90 minutes with my good friends at the Holy Blossom congregation, which, as both of you have mentioned, I have visited many, many times. And I have great memories from these meetings and sessions. So hopefully we'll have a good time together tonight. The topic, unfortunately, is always timely. Hopefully I will be able to shed some new light on old problems, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion. I'm not sure whether or not I'll have enough time to get into the depth of all the complexities and dilemmas and challenges involved. In case I don't, I have a written form of this presentation, and it will be accessible to all of you who desire to think a little bit more about this. So let me go ahead right away, and let me just tell you what I'm going to talk about. My conception of national security, that it is a response to threats against the existence of a national community or against interests vital to the existence of such community. Such a community can be a state, as in the case of the state of Israel, can be smaller, as it can be a community within a country, say the Druze community within Israel. And it can be much larger and encompassing. In the case of Israel, it's worldwide Jewish communities and so on and so forth. But in any case, national security arises only in response to threats. No threat, no national security, no need for it. And therefore, the thing to do is to diagnose the threats and to see what the appropriate responses are to these threats. And then you have national security. In the case of Israel, national security thinking started systematically with David Ben-Gurion taking over the defense ministry even before the establishment of the state in 1947, and thinking systematically. And he basically presented the problems of Israeli security in 8 points, which I'm going to share with you right now. And we will see that practically none of these points is relevant today, as it was at the time. To the extent that it is relevant, it has to be modernized, has to be adapted, has to be altered, has to be brought up to date. But the towering figure who invented this type of thinking in Israel is still Ben-Gurion. Nothing like him and nobody like him. So let's start with his thoughts. And Ben-Gurion used to say many interesting things. Let me start with 3 of them. First of all, his attitude to science, expertise, and various types of knowledge. And he says, if an expert says it cannot be done, get another expert. The experts are important, but you should never lose sight of your overall goal. And the overall goal is not dictated by science, but by strategic and political thinking. 2, thought is a strenuous art. Few practice it, and then only at rare times. Ben-Gurion was impatient with people who were tacticians. He wanted people to do strategic thinking, and if they didn't, he did. And finally, he said, and let me listen to this, and I will want you to think about this sentence for a moment or two before we go on. The most dangerous enemy to Israel's security is the intellectual inertia of those who are responsible for security. Let me repeat that. The most dangerous enemy to Israel's security is the intellectual inertia of those who are responsible for security. With all these thoughts in mind, let's go on and let's look at the 8 points one by one. Point number 1 by Ben-Gurion: Israel is surrounded by enemy countries seeking to destroy it. This is an existential threat that needs to be repelled. But it cannot be achieved by military means alone, which is to say, it is not possible for Israel by military means to impose peace on the Arabs. Israeli military might will only gain time to change the political situation in the Arab countries. That is the threat. But why do the Arab countries want to destroy Israel? And what will time do when we buy it? He couldn't quite define, but he vaguely thought that things might change in terms of the national priorities within the various Arab countries, which is what happened. But when you look at this definition, it's no longer good. Israel is not surrounded by countries which seek to destroy it. In fact, there is no Arab-Israeli conflict anymore. There is something else which is difficult to define. The Arab countries are not leading the fight against Zionism anymore. The most outspoken countries in terms of anti-Zionism are Iran and Turkey. None of them are Arab. With Turkey too, there is sort of a rapprochement brewing with the projected visit of our President Herzog in Turkey sometime in the next few weeks. So there is no Arab-Israeli conflict as such. There is still the Palestinian-Israeli conflict at the heart of it all. But Egyptian soldiers, when they enter the Sinai, do not detract from Israel's security, but add to it. The Syrian army is no longer a capable force threatening Israel. Lebanon is no longer a state. It's a non-state. And with Jordan, we have decent relations as well. So this ancient saying is no good anymore. Who the enemy really is hard to define. Is it Islam? Obviously, it is not. I mean, Islam is all over. The largest Islamic community in the world is in Indonesia. thousands of miles away from Israel, with no particular problems between us. And there are many Muslim countries with which we have cordial accords now, say the Abraham Accords. So it's not Islam. Is it Shiite Islam reigning in Iran? Then what are the Turks doing in the business? They are Sunnis. What is Hamas doing in the business? They're also Sunnis. So there's a new kind of enemy. And I think it's more a matter of geopolitical rivalry, which is taking ideological forms than the other way around. It is no longer an ideological obsession, which is expressed in geopolitical terms, but it's a geopolitical rivalry for the mastery of the Middle East, for domination of the Middle East, for hegemony in the Middle East and such, which is using ideological excuses, ideological forms of expression, of rhetoric, but are not really dictated by ideology as such. So we need to redefine the threat. Is there a threat? According to the official definition of the Israeli Intelligence Service, which submits an annual report on the state of the nation, it says there is only one existential threat now facing Israel, which is the Iranian nuclear project. That's a whole new issue. So the old definition of Arab-Israeli conflict, countries surrounding us, tanks going down the Golan Heights and so on, no longer true. Two, the constraint of Israel as a small country, small area with a small population. Says Ben Gurion, Israel is not capable of absorbing an attack on its own territory because the major cities are densely populated, and we are a Jewish society particularly sensitive to the loss of human life. Therefore, if there is a battle, if there's a campaign, if there is a war, there is a fight, it must be transferred to enemy territory, which is what we did in 1948-49, 1956, 1967, 1973, 1982. Is it possible to do this today? We haven't really been successful with this. We have tried to transfer the fight against Hezbollah into Lebanon, did not really succeed. We have been into the Gaza Strip any number of times, 5 times in the last decade and a half, no good. Can we transfer the fight into Iranian territory, for example? Can we transfer the fight directly into Syrian territory, fighting Iranian proxies? Yes and no, not in the form envisaged by Ben Gurion, but by some new tool, which is conceptually defined in Israel as the campaign between the wars. Something which involves intensive fighting for 2 purposes, both deterrence and prevention. But it's not really a battle, it's not really a campaign, it's not really a war, it's a series of small engagements on selected targets and not even on the enemy territory. The enemy is Iran and the territory is Syria. The fight against proxy is something entirely different. Next, point number 3 is the real, I think, motto of Ben Gurion, which was asymmetry. The major problem of Israeli national security is asymmetry between Israel and the Arab state. Israel is small, the Arabs are big. Israelis are few, the Arabs are many. Israel is poor, the Arabs are rich, and so on and so forth. So whatever you think about military resources and so on, it's not possible to resist the might of the Arabs by emphasizing quantity. The only answer is qualitative, and what Israel needs to seek is qualitative edge over its enemies. Quality meaning technology, quality meaning science, quality meaning education, quality meaning research, quality meaning a highly educated and a highly motivated pool of manpower on which Israel can draw if and when it is attacked. This was emphasized by Ben Gurion to such an extent that he cut down on military budgets throughout the first few years of his rule in order to invest more in education, science, and technology, by the way, with a great deal of success. Even today, if you think of Israel as a military bastion, you should know the facts of life, namely that Israel invests in defense, at least directly, something like 5.6% of its GDP, whereas it invests in education a bit over 6% of its GDP. So the military budget is not the largest, and it shouldn't be. Nevertheless, this qualitative edge is at risk today for many reasons. The main enemy, Iran, seems like a backward country, but it isn't. It has a very large middle class, which is highly educated, highly motivated, highly knowledgeable. Iran has good universities. It has numerous scientific publications. It is innovative. It is very, very forward-looking, and it's certainly a formidable adversary of the type which we have not yet met. It's not Egypt, and it's not Syria, and it's not Jordan, and not Lebanon. Secondly, in order to maximize our political potential in the region, we have had to make agreements. For example, the Abraham Accords, particularly with the UAE, which is the leader in this field, which meant that we have had to agree to upgrading their weaponry and their arms deals with the United States to a point that the technology they are getting is competitive with that of Israel. Now, let me tell you about something else. At the moment, the people in the United Arab Emirates are scared stiff of the drone attacks they have suffered from the Houthis in the Yemen. Obviously, Iranian equipment, Iranian trained, Iranian supplied, and so on and so forth. And we have been asked to help. What good are the Abraham Accords if Israel is not helping against Iran? So now we are in the dilemma. If we transfer the kind of abilities we now have, the kind of defensive capabilities we have to shoot down some of these drones, we put them at the disposal of a country which has still good relations with some of our enemies, which might not be stable over a long time, which might share this knowledge, this technology, this qualitative edge with other countries in the Middle East, and we will lose our hegemony in qualitative terms. This is something new, which Ben-Gurion never really envisaged. 4, in order to fight, we need the largest army we can possibly provide. We don't have a large army. We have a small army. We have a large reserve pool. Roughly speaking, historically, I'm not saying anything about the present situation, historically, 75% of our fighting force was reservists, and only a quarter or less was our permanent military establishment, mostly in the Air Force, the Navy, and the technological branches, as well as intelligence. In order to mobilize the reservists, you need time. In order to use the time, you need a warning, which means that the military establishment, its intelligence arms, and the civilian intelligence branches have to give you a warning about the capabilities and the intentions of the enemy, which will give you time to mobilize the reserves. This is no longer true. There is no time. We have a kind of technological situation in the Middle East in which you don't have to mobilize armies because you don't need the armies on the battlefield. You need technological capabilities, rockets are flying, missiles are flying, airplanes are flying. There is no time. And the idea that the intelligence community will be able to tell you what will happen next in time to mobilize hundreds of thousands of civilians in Israel is totally outmoded. Never mind that even if you want to mobilize hundreds of thousands of reservists in Israel, you will not be able to, because all the roads, all the junctions, all the bridges, all the transport concentration of resources will be hit by thousands of missiles per day, not from Iran, but from Lebanon and possibly from the Gaza Strip. So that won't do. 5, deterrence. What is the conceptual tool by which you live in peace with enemies who seek to destroy you? One and only one, it's called deterrence. Deterrence means a rational calculus by which you convince your enemies that any possible gain which might accrue to them from attacking you will be outweighed by the absolutely certain loss that they will suffer. You will inflict so much damage on the enemy that fighting you for the enemy is not going to be worthwhile. And you can achieve this deterrence in a number of ways. You can hit either the states which host those who seek to destroy you, including terrorists, including guerrillas, including Fedayeen, and so on. Or else you can hit those people, their families, their villages, the regions where they come from, and thereby exact a price which will make fighting you simply not worthwhile for them. This is very nice, and it worked for a while. But history tells us that every decade or so, deterrence collapsed, and there was a need for a war to reestablish it, partly because of the asymmetry. it was not credible for 70 million Egyptians to be deterred by 2 million Israelis. Just to give you just one example. Today, different problems arise. How do you deter terrorist organizations? What are you going to do to the Hamas in Gaza? How are you going to deter them? You're going to tell them, if you hit us, we will hit your population? You don't want to hit their population. It's not within your values. It's not something that you ethically or morally or philosophically wish to do. Also, it doesn't pay. It will only mobilize more people to support Hamas. You want to overthrow Hamas? Maybe. How? By force? Okay, then what? There is going to be a vacuum in Gaza. And who is going to step into a vacuum? There is no vacuum in politics and strategy. It is always filled by outside forces. Who are those forces? Well, Islamic Jihad, even worse. ISIS, even worse. Chaos, terrible. Get the PLO to rule, supported by Israeli tanks, at what price? Why should Abu Mazen do that? What's in it for him? So the idea of deterrence in the classical sense doesn't work anymore. Something else needs to be considered. What is being considered, we'll see in a few minutes. Point 6, says Ben Gurion. Well, deterrence fails once in a while, he realized that. If and when it does, you need to fight. And if you fight, you should fight to win. You should not fight for a tie or a draw. You should not fight for a win by points. You should try for a knockout. Nothing else will do. Certainly nothing less will do. Because if you don't reach a decision, meaning a decisive win, deterrence will lose. Deterrence will diminish. Deterrence will dissipate, and eventually it will disappear. It will become irrelevant. Now, what is a decision in the classic Israeli military thinking of Ben Gurion and his successors? To get to a point where the enemy asks for a ceasefire while our troops are still deep in its territory, when we have already destroyed much of the enemy's fighting capability, at the same time have also hit some of the values and symbols of the enemy regime, its radio stations, its airports, its military staff, and so on and so forth. And we have made it good any number of times, 1949, 1956, 1967, even 1973. But how can we do that now? What territory can we invade? Once again, we have invaded Gaza 5 times. We have come back 5 times. We invaded Lebanon twice, and we came back twice. Did we reach a decision? Did we achieve a decisive victory against Hamas in Gaza? I doubt it. Did we get a knockout blow against Hezbollah in 2006? I doubt that too. Although our deterrence was perhaps enhanced by that particular operation. And how do you deter the Iranians today? Because what they are doing is slowly but steadily, and I think very skillfully, building up its capabilities for the future, reaching with their long arms at our sensitive points near our border by proxies. Then what do? You really want to transfer to fight to the Iranian territory, which will accelerate the process, which will incite perhaps a major war in the region, which is certainly not in our interest. So the question of deterrence needs to be addressed, I think, more profoundly, in a much more elaborate and sophisticated way. And we have to find new means of deterrence in an age of technology, when distance and change, when territory changes and military technology changes drastically and dramatically. Point 7, Ben Gurion developed, I think, an extremely sophisticated doctrine of the so-called ambiguous nuclear deterrent. This was a matter of great controversy in Israel. Many people felt that it was too big, too heavy, too expensive for Israel to get into a project of this kind. Other people felt it was immoral for Israel to do so. I mean, there was something immoral, something morally, ethically, and philosophically, even religiously reprehensible about nuclear power a few years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But Ben Gurion felt, and this has to be said today, which is Holocaust Remembrance Day around the world, that it was the memory of the Holocaust which drove Ben Gurion to this point, saying that now that 1/3 of our people have been literally obliterated by wicked forces, there is no stone that should be left unturned to make sure it doesn't happen again. And if nuclear power is under that stone, let's turn the stone. Of course, as you know, opportunity came with the 1956 Sinai-Suez War and the French involvement in it. And since then, everybody around the world has been convinced that Israel has nuclear capabilities. Israel doesn't admit it and doesn't really deny it either. So this is nuclear ambiguity. Nuclear ambiguity has been an enormous success from the Israeli point of view because it achieves everything that open nuclear power would without paying the price. And even now, Israel continues to be ambiguous. But what does ambiguity really mean? Ambiguity can be one of three things. So let me try this out. Let us say one of you, let's call that one of you Joe, is really a very, very vociferous enemy of mine. And then he asked me, Gabi, do you have a gun in your pocket? I can refuse to answer, this is ambiguity, in three very different ways. I can say, Joe, you know very well I do not have a gun in my pocket, but since you are my enemy, I don't want you to sleep well at night, so I won't admit that I don't have a gun. Second would be, Joe, you know very well that I do have a gun, but I don't want to admit it because I don't want your friends to give you a gun also. That would be ambiguity 2. And ambiguity 3 would be, Joe, you are my enemy, I won't say anything in response to your question. So everybody can see that the Israeli game plan is nuclear ambiguity 2. I mean, say nothing which would reinforce any kind of admission that you actually possess nuclear weapons, but make sure everybody knows, everybody thinks they know that you do have it. It has worked wonders. Israel has also gone a long way towards establishing the impression that it also has a second strike capability with its very efficient Air Force, and even more so by its submarine fleet, which is being openly presented to the world every time a submarine comes home from Germany, the latest word in submarine technology, and then everybody says, well, the submarines can carry so many nuclear missiles and that they have the range of this and that, and so on and so forth. So this has been a very big success. And Israeli philosophers who study Arab thinking keep telling me that one of the main reasons why the leading forces in the Arab world, Egyptians, Saudis, and so on, have changed their minds about the possibility of coexistence with Israel is the impression that no matter what they do, and no matter how efficiently they mobilize their resources to achieve some kind of conventional superiority over Israel, which they might be able to do because of the so-called asymmetry, which we have mentioned several times already in this lecture, even then, they won't be able to get rid of Israel physically because of the Israeli capability to destroy them, even by a second strike. But all this is true in a world in which the Middle East region doesn't have anybody else who has nuclear power. And so then comes the begging doctrine, which says that Israel will not allow a hostile power in the Middle East to acquire and possess nuclear weapons. This doctrine was put into action, as you know, in 1981 against Iraq, in 2007 against Syria, now more or less openly admitted by Israel, only now, 15 years later. And there's a question of Iran coming up. But what do you do when the Iranians are so close to nuclear weapons? By the way, there's a lot of mystery and a lot of verbiage about Iranian capabilities. So let me tell you what I think is the factual situation. Iran is indeed, within a few months, at the most, perhaps even few weeks of acquiring weapon-ready, high-quality uranium. But once it does, and it's a significant step, it will still need about 2 years to weaponize the uranium. I mean, to miniaturize it, put it in the form of a weapon which can be put on a missile and can be operation ready to deliver it elsewhere. That's the time frame. Now, within that time frame, whether or not there is an agreement in Vienna, we will speak about that in a moment. There is a question of what Israel should do in terms of its ambiguous nuclear deterrent. Should it go open and admit to some kind of nuclear capability as a better form of deterrence? Should it not? Should it do something altogether different, like reaching some kind of regional accommodation, which will make this entire Israeli form of deterrence outmoded? An idea elaborated upon by the late Shimon Peres when he was president. So that's a huge question now. And I think there's a need for a paradigm change. The present paradigm in Israel is that we have to do everything, if necessary, by ourselves to deny Iran nuclear weapons. That comes at a very, very high price. And I think that we need to consider two alternative paradigms. One, it's not just our problem. Others are more threatened by these weapons, if they ever exist, than we are. The main objective of Iran is not Israel, but regional hegemony over countries like Iraq, like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt and Turkey. Let all those who feel threatened get together with American support, with Western support, and with our participation, sort of a NATO-like conglomerate to contain Iran. It's too big, too complicated, and too heavy for Israel to handle by itself. So let's stop all this rhetoric of we will never agree, we will never let. Second paradigm, which is now quietly being entertained in Israel, very few will admit it, but there it is to think what happens if Iran does go nuclear. And we cannot prevent it. Can we coexist with that? If so, how? What does it mean for us? Huge dilemma. 8. Ben Gurion was sometimes a complicated figure with a lot of oxymorons, self-contradictory statements. He used to say it doesn't matter what the Gentiles do, what matters is what the Gentiles say, what matters is what the Jews do. But at the same time, he also said Israel must not be involved in strategic and security tensions if it doesn't have the active support of at least one major superpower. And this was achieved at all times. In 1948-49, some of you might not remember this, it was Soviet support for things. In 1956, French support. Since the 1960s, of course, American support. The American connection is huge. The special American-Israeli relationship, you heard about this last lecture, I understand, from the Israeli point of view, is one of the biggest assets of Israel's national security. There is nothing like it, nothing worthwhile to achieve if you need to sacrifice it. And so you must secure it at all costs. But at the same time, ladies and gentlemen, Israel today is in a golden age. It has good relations with all the great powers around the world. Its special relationship with the United States, albeit strained once in a while, still very strong. At the same time, we have more than correct relations with Putin's Russia. And by the way, we are embarrassed having to choose between Russia and the Ukraine at the present time. We have excellent relations with the coming superpower, India, very close and warm relations, security-wise and otherwise. And we have excellent relations with China, the main rival of the United States today. And that's embarrassing. American statesmen, American Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, and so on, keep coming to Israel, make statements about fighting against terrorism and containing Iran and the nuclear problem. But I'm told by our people that the first issue they really raise is China. China is heavily invested in Israel, and especially in Israeli infrastructure. In my home city of Haifa, where I am at the moment, almost everything which is worthwhile is Chinese. The highways, the roads, the tunnels, the bridges, the new harbor being built. Okay, never mind the small tools and gimmicks in our homes. China has acquired great investment in various key Israeli companies, in food production, in technology, in communications and transportation. The Americans are worried about this, and they are pressuring Israel to lessen Chinese involvement in sensitive Israeli technology and such. We are embarrassed. We have nothing against China. We have no problems with China whatsoever. In fact, we have very good relations with China, and I think it's mutually beneficial. My own university has 2 branches in China. I have Chinese students in my international classes all over. And there's nothing but friendship between us in that sense, never mind commercial investment and such. But I think we will have to choose between the United States and China. If I read the geopolitical situation correctly on the global scene, we won't be able to sit on the sidelines for long. And because we have this ambiguous of friendship with all these countries, we will have to choose between Russia and the Ukraine at one point. And also we will have to choose between the United States and China. And there is no real dilemma there anymore. I mean, the choice is obviously the United States. So all in all, we need to take into account that on the one hand, we are facing threats of different strengths and levels, but on the other hand, we are correctly in an era of political process. The Abraham Accords, the peace with Egypt and Jordan and such, with an opportunity to advance national security to an even higher level, all of which require a change in Israel's national security concept. And because I'm running out of time, I will give you just a few pointers of what else needs to be done in order to move Israeli strategic thinking to an even higher level. And these are the issues, and I'll end on this. We need to develop further the concept of the campaign between the wars. How much farther do we want to go in fighting on Syrian soil at the time when the Russians actually ruled Syrian skies and sea lanes? And to what extent this really helps contain Iran in the future? Second, we need to decide what we really want to do about the periodic bouts with Hamas and Hezbollah. How do we prevent them if that's what we want? How do we conduct them if we merely want to manage them? Or how do we bring about a decisive result if that's what we want? What type of future do we envisage for the Gaza Strip? And what type of state Lebanon will be? And what we can do perhaps to enhance the process. We need to acknowledge that we no longer have so much concern with conventional warfare. The warfare we are facing is either sub-conventional, non-state organizations, or super conventional, long-range missiles, rockets, and perhaps nuclear threats. Our concept of the people's army is in danger. As you know, we have compulsory draft conscription among Jews and a small minority of Arabic-speaking people, the Druze. But the figures tell us the following. 20% of Israel's population, Arabs, are not conscripted. 9 to 10% ultra-Orthodox are not conscripted. So of the others, about 20% are excused on religious grounds, religious women, for example, health grounds, mental health grounds, and such. In short, only half the people actually are drafted into the military. But do we need all these people in a highly technological age? Do we need a professional army, people who are well paid, who serve all their lives, who give us the kind of technological edge which we cannot maintain without the best people being in the military? Or do we really want to stick to a universal conscription system of very poorly paid people who serve because they have to. Our strategic culture might need to change. Let me just give a short example of what I have in mind, because I would like to end in a minute or two to give you time for questions. Israel is known as the startup nation, highly innovative technologically. Research tells us the following. The Russians are quick to think about concepts of new strategy in the light of technological change, but they are slow to develop technology. The technology is not of high quality, and it develops very slowly. The Americans develop very quickly their technology, and they don't always realize its military potential, and certainly not its overall strategic potential, because of the very decentralized and very complicated structure of their military system. Israel is somewhere in between. It doesn't have really the kind of strategic planning that the Russians do, but it is quicker than the Americans to absorb technology on the go. But I think we need to do more thinking like the Russians about what the future of warfare will be like, and then develop the appropriate technology with the speed we are known for. Our speed is also something that leads us to hastiness at times and impatience. We are always the leaders in the world in something until we get sick and tired of it, and then we go on to the next thing. We need to develop a more patient, persistent, and systematic strategic culture. 2 quick points. There's a decline in the Israeli public in terms of trust in the military. The military is no longer the icon everybody worships. There is more criticism. And this is something the military will have to learn to live with. There is a domestic front we used to ignore. And we were really hit badly in May last year, realizing that domestic front is still here and we are not prepared to face it. And finally, the so-called struggle for the narrative. We are losing badly in that one. We are losing friends around the world because we are not projecting the right image, because we are not telling them what the Zionist narrative is really about. They don't know the good things about Israel. They don't know the restraints, the ethics, and I think the conscience that Israel lives with when it has to fight. And I think that in that sense, we are doing badly. All in all, let me just summarize and say that we used to have good strategic thinking and good security thinking. We used to have a founding father and many disciples of his who used to think in such terms and were able to come up with something that worked very well over the years, but which needs to be changed drastically because the threat has changed and our responses must change as well. And as Gurion himself used to say, and I end with this, we need to be courageous. But what is courage? Courage is the knowledge of how to fear what ought to be feared and how not to fear what ought not to be feared. And finally, he used to say, and I think this is the best sentence to end with, it's not enough to be up to date, you have to be up to tomorrow. And Gurion's own teachings are yesterday's teachings. And we need to bring them up to date if we want to be able to face the future with the kind of confidence and success that he enjoyed in his days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabby. That was a wonderful presentation, excellent. We are going to move into questions and answers, and we're first going to do questions among our panel members. I'll start with a couple of questions, and then we have one question that's come in from our participants, which we'll get to. And what we're going to do is we're going to cluster our questions, 2 or 3 of them at a time, and then turn it over to Gabby to answer them. So I'm going to start with 2 questions, and then I'm going to open it up to John, David, and Howard. Gabby, you mentioned Israel needs to do some rethink about how to deal with with the terrorist organizations, Hamas, Hezbollah, and so on. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or ideas, if you were to be sort of in the inner circle, recommending to the cabinet what to do about it, what thoughts you would convey to them as terms of policy recommendations on that. Secondly, what are your thoughts about a volunteer professional army for Israel? Is that a realistic policy option for Israel? And if so, how do you see that unfolding? Maybe we'll start with those 2 questions, then I'll turn it over to the panel.
Okay, let me start with the first one, of course. I think that I would like to follow a realistic policy of if you can't beat them, join them. If you cannot get Hamas out of Gaza, then live with Hamas in Gaza and let Hamas rule in Gaza. And make sure that Hamas is responsible for what happens as a state should be. When Hamas does something wrong, hit them. When Hamas attacks you, attack them back. If Hamas wants to rule and to live alongside Israel, with or without a peace treaty, let them. And let them prosper up to a point where they have something to lose. My general thinking is that we have been able to deal with states successfully. We have not been able to deal successfully with non-states. So if you allow states to, if you get to the point where you allow non-states to become states, you're better off. It's better off for me to live with a Gazan state ruled by Hamas than with the mess we have now. As for Lebanon, same type of thinking. I don't care if Hezbollah takes over Lebanon. As long as somebody rules in Lebanon, as long as there is a government. The greatest enemy of a stable order in the Middle East is not tyranny, but anarchy. The thing to do is to establish states you can deal with, you can negotiate with, you can bargain with, states you can deter. I think, therefore, that when terrorist organizations are proliferating all over, like ISIS, it's bad. But when you have a territorially organized band, which might become a state, with a lot to lose, with some kind of order it can maintain, I think we should go along with that. If we are unable to put somebody else in power, we tried to put somebody in power in Lebanon and we failed. We don't know who to put in power in Gaza. And therefore we have failed in our ability to decide the war against them. So let whoever rules rule, as long as we get into the rational calculus of deterrence. Okay, so that is my view on that. In terms of a professional army, I really haven't made up my mind on that yet. I think that the present situation cannot continue. The present situation where we pretend we have a universal conscription system, but we don't really draft everybody is not good. So I think that we might go for some compromise. We won't be able to afford a purely professional army, but we will have to do a more selective draft system, whereby people who are drafted will be excused much more easily than today, and it will not be shameful sociologically. But at the same time, those who do go into the army, I think will be rewarded much more, I think, generously in terms of financial rewards and other opportunities later to gain some advantages by the long military service, which we need, because we need long military service. The 2 or 3 year conscription system is also no good, because we need a more technological army. We need professionals who study what they do and who have experience and who have developed their skills by formal education. And that requires a change in concept. So I think the People's Army is not something we can give up because it's part of our ethos and also very important economically. But I think that the present situation of neither here nor there cannot continue indefinitely.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask John Allen and Howard Edelman to ask their questions. We'll cluster those questions and then turn them over to you. John, please.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Gabby. Thanks, Mark. I want to move a little bit away from classic strategic talk to the question of the other threat that people talk about now to Israel, which is the threat to its Jewish and democratic nature. If the domestic issue, or I'm not sure whether it's domestic or foreign policy, there's a debate about that, but if the issue of the occupation is not dealt with in the medium to long term. So that's one question is that an existential threat to Israel, and how do you think it should be dealt with? I also want to just relate to your question about the narrative and the fact that Israel is perhaps losing the narrative. And I would suggest that part of the reason it's losing the narrative is because, unlike some other Western countries, Israel doesn't really deal with the issue of values versus interests very much. Part of the problem, I think, in that regard is the treatment of the Palestinians. But when you talk about Israel's great relations with Russia, China, and India, that strikes me as part of the problem. Israel has no problems dealing with those countries, irrespective of their human rights situations, Russia, China, etc. So it is part of Israel's narrative problem, because they are prepared, for perhaps very valid reasons, to deal with countries openly without ever criticizing them. So if you could, that's sort of just a package of questions, but they're, I think, related. Thanks very much.
Howard, and then we'll turn it over to Dan.
Well, I want to bring it back to the big strategic issue, if we could. I'll mention one thing about the narrative. In one sense, Israel won the narrative in that there's by and large a consensus that the Palestinians are no longer the central issue for insecurity in the Middle East. That's become a widespread consensus. It's not universal, but it has been widespread. But going back to the security issue, and Iran as the major enemy, part of the analysis requires not only development of changes within Israel and its strategy, but problems with your main enemy. And Iran has, as you know very well, ecological problems, problems of electricity, revolts among its people against its non-delivery of goods. So it has inner tensions. It also has tensions with its proxies, such as in Iraq, where the Shiite proxies lost out to others, and Iraq is changing. And in Syria, it has a different picture, because they seem to have a deal with Russia in sharing airspace and giving Israel free rein to bomb Hezbollah and Iranian sites. So each situation varies with the proxies of Iran, and it's a changing picture. Can you comment on those changes?
Yes, thank you for these questions, which are very, very good, if I may say so. Let me start with the second one, which is easier. Iran, let me comment on the Iranian-Israel relations in general. It will take only a minute or two. I think it's a bogey rivalry. Israel and Iran really have no problems. There is no territorial question between them. There is no real ideological problem between them either. As a matter of fact, they have a lot in common. Actually, the Shiites, which is the main axis that Iranians are using, are a minority in the Middle East against a very aggressive Sunni majority, as are the Jews in Israel. So in fact, if anything, they are natural allies, and they used to be. I mean, I used to be in Iran during those very good days of the golden relationship with the Shah's regime. We have no problem with the Iranian problem, Iranian people, Iranian culture, the Iranian state, or the Iranian drive for hegemony in the Persian Gulf. It's not our business. I think that the Iranians are using the anti-Zionist issue really to advance and promote their geopolitical goals. And I think there are better historians here than I am, that one lesson from history would be that when the ideological messianic zeal of this theocratic regime declines or recedes or disappears, God willing, then we'll be able to do business with Iranians once again. So I wouldn't really like to make the Iranian-Israeli tensions bigger than they are in a profound look. As for the rivalry over the territory of Syria, well, there is only so much we can do there. What we are doing is two things. We are trying to make sure that no Iranian bases are established near the Israeli border, and the Russians are cooperating with us on that. Secondly, we are trying to prevent sophisticated advanced weaponry being smuggled through Syrian territory to the hands of the Hezbollah, and we are involved, as you know, in almost nightly aerial fights over that. None of this would be possible without the so-called deconfliction mechanism with the Russians. If the Russians didn't want us to do this, we couldn't, and we wouldn't. But the Russians have no vested interest in making the Iranians the masters over Syria. the Russians want to stabilize the Syrian regime and to legitimize it in the long run. They don't want to stay on the ground and fight for it forever. And for that, they need Israeli cooperation. And I think we should cooperate with them. We are not the ones who should decide who rules in Syria. Whoever rules in Syria, you know my theory of stateness. Whoever rules is fine, as long as we can get along, because we have an orderly relationship of bargaining, of deterrence, of agreements, and so on and so forth. And I think that we have just about exhausted the possibilities we have. And I think we should cooperate with the Russians on the diplomatic front, legitimizing the regime and getting all the foreign powers out. This is something the Russians say is the slogan they believe in, a motto they believe in. The Syrian government cannot say it too openly because of the tension with the Iranians. And as you say, Har, there is a tension between Iran and its proxies, and there's a tension between Syria and Iran. I'm sorry, and Russia and Iran as well. And I think we should play along with Russians on this one. To the very difficult questions by John on the Palestinian front. I mean, that alone should take not one lecture, but a series of 25. But I think you're right. I mean, that one part of the problem of the narrative is the lack of resolution of the Palestinian issue. The question is, what would be worse? Trying to resolve the Palestinian issue now with the players we have and with the issues we have, or going on and saying we are going to do business with everybody in the Middle East, Abraham Accords, Egyptians, everybody and like, and we try to lighten the burdens on the Palestinians, but we cannot resolve the problem at this point. Why not? Well, neither of the two sides is ready. The Palestinians are in a terrible mess. They have two states of their own already, West Bank and Gaza. Leadership is under attack. It is old, it's corrupt, it is delegitimized. And certainly it cannot make the concessions needed in order to coexist with Israel. And within Israel, we have a government of 8 parties, which can agree on one thing, 2 things. One is Benjamin and the other is Netanyahu, nothing else. And if Netanyahu did something is wrong, if Netanyahu didn't do it is right, including in the pandemic. I mean, if whatever Netanyahu did, we do the opposite. Whether or not it works. So they cannot, I mean, not only that, but they vociferously agreed to disagree on the Palestinian issue. And whenever somebody makes a step, like my former student Gantz, the defense minister, who takes the initiative on the Palestinian front, the prime minister is quick to say, no, we're not going to go on with this anymore. So the situation is not right. So what do you do? But I'm talking about narrative even in a bigger sense. When I go to a Western European university and then a very advanced graduate student tells me he, in this case, she doesn't believe that the Jews have any connection with Jerusalem. I mean, that's losing the narrative. To say, you guys are not treating the Palestinians right, you should establish a Palestinian state alongside Israel, blah, 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 the military regime is not, okay, fine. That's a kind of criticism I think we should listen to and get along with one way or another. But to say that the Jews have no connection with Jerusalem, it's a Zionist fabrication, that means losing the narrative. So I think we have to reinforce the narrative that the Jews are a people, that they have a right to a state, they have a historical connection with the so-called land of Israel, Palestine. What part of it should the Jewish state be, and what should be done with the Palestinian minority, and so on and so forth? Legitimate question, which we should debate, I think, eagerly, is whoever is coming to the table with clean hands. But to say that the whole idea is a colonialist fabrication, which has no basis in history, that to me means losing the nerve.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to ask David, and then Howard. I think you might have had another question or comment you wanted to have. So David, and then Howard, and then I think we'll open it up to. We'll go over to the questions from our participants.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to move back to the strategic and to ask you to think out loud about the regional security context. Because it seems to me that where many of your comments were either leading or intimating was that there are some profound changes that are occurring regionally. And it provides an opportunity for states to engage other states in ways that perhaps were not conceived as possible. And I'm it's really an open-ended question, Gabi, in terms of how do you imagine this process being encouraged, and where are the links that are most likely to be initially attractive to an Israeli initiative?
Well, changes are indeed taking place, as you say, around the region. And we have seen some of this coming to fruition in the Abraham Accords, which are very important. Sometimes they're referred to as peace agreements, which they are not. Because peace agreements come after fighting wars. We never fought a war with the UAE or Bahrain or the Sudan or Morocco, the 4 countries involved. These are normalization agreements. And that's more important because that's something really new. That means not the grudging admiration by the Egyptians, we cannot beat the Jewish state, so let's live with it somehow. But it says that there is something positive about doing business with the Jewish state. Now, why are they doing business with the Jewish state, say the UAE or Bahrain? 3 reasons. One is Israeli technology and capabilities, obviously. Second is the common enemy, Iran. And 3, the common ally, the United States. Now that the United States is not entirely out of the equation, but is showing hesitancy and weakness all over, the other 2 are perhaps not sufficient to go to the next step. There is already the Iranian threat, which is so ominous that both the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the 2 key countries in the region, are making overtures toward the regime in Tehran, sending emissaries to negotiate and trying to engineer a rapprochement between these countries. Hedging their bets, so to speak, without abandoning the Israeli connection. And that makes us think, I mean, what is to be done? What can we do? Can we really go and help them militarily against Iran while they are negotiating with Iran? As I intimated, do we want to share our technology with them, which might spill on and over to our would-be enemies? Can we put together a real NATO-like, I think, relationship or alliance or form of solidarity, which will contain Iran with these people, especially if the United States doesn't want to get involved as heavily as it used to. So I think these questions are being asked all over, and that's the reason for the hesitancy, not so much in Israel, but in the given Arab countries. For example, it was assumed for a long time the next step would be to expand the Abraham Accords with Saudi Arabia, the key actor in the region. The Saudis are reluctant for the reasons I have mentioned, as well as for yet another reason, their domestic front, and the transition from the old regime of the king, the alien king who sticks to the old Arab line, as opposed to the crown prince known as MBS around the world. It also comes back to John's question about values and interests. All countries in the world are involved in this kind of dilemma, of course, and great powers can afford to be choosier on this. If you're asking me, are you eager to make business with the Saudis, who are known opponents of everything I believe in? Human rights, liberalism, openness, democracy. I don't know. I mean, yes, I want to do business with them, and perhaps by doing business with me and by stabilizing the region, we are paving the way for modernization, even democratization, and so on and so forth. So we are open to do business with them. My personal view is that there is not going to be an expansion of the Abraham Accords anytime in the foreseeable future for the reasons I mentioned. Without a very solid American axis in the middle of all this, really determined to face down Iran. The other countries are not getting out of the accords one of the main things they wanted. And I think Israel and these Arab countries together are not a strong enough alliance to contain Iran, as simple as that. And for that reason, there's not going to be an expansion. Now, if the Biden administration were to change its stance on this, things might open up. I really don't know. I hesitate to speak about the past because I feel about Mr. Trump much as Bennett feels about Netanyahu. I mean, if Trump did it, it couldn't be right. But I think he did many things. I mean, he did many things right on the Abraham Accords business, and he projected an image of American interest and American involvement, American investment, and American commitment, all of which are lacking under the Biden administration. So much as I think that Biden reads the map correctly in many ways, in terms of the rivalry with China, in terms of the need to revitalize American society, infrastructure, technology, human rights. I'm all for it. But I think the image projects here in the Middle East means that there cannot be any further progress in changing the regional scene towards more accords, more normalization, and more regional cooperation.
Howard, did you have another question?
Yeah, I
then,
wanted
John,
to
you have-
ask Gabi to zero in specifically on Lebanon, with Harari leaving, with
Hariri.
Yeah, with the Hezbollah getting accurate missiles now and building an accurate missile system, with the problems of early warning with that, with the technological problem, because I see that as the real dangerous proxy in the region. Can you comment on that?
Yes, I think you're right. I think the dangerous proxy of Iran is indeed Hezbollah. I think that the Iranians have invested a great deal in building up Hezbollah to the point where it is. And I think it's a formidable opponent, no question about it. Also, if we were to do anything about the Iranian nuclear business itself, the Iranians would instantly retaliate by unleashing Hezbollah's 150,000 or 200,000 rockets and missiles all over the country, perhaps even with the participation of Hamas. That's a clear and present danger that we are thinking about. Now, on the other side of the equation is the following. Hezbollah is a Lebanese organization. It is a Shiite organization, and it is subservient in many ways to Iran. But as you yourself have intimated, Howard, there is tension between Iran and its proxies. Iran is Iran, and Hezbollah is Lebanese. Hezbollah has been criticized in Lebanon heavily for its involvement in Syria, fighting other Arabs and Arab Muslims. Lebanese were not happy about that. Hezbollah paid a heavy price for it. It had many casualties and it spent an awful lot of money. We know that Iran is now allocating fewer funds than it used to because of its own difficulties to Hezbollah. And above all, we know that Hezbollah is enjoying playing the political game inside Lebanon. It is part of the cabinet. It's very important in parliamentary debates. It is very important as a social movement all over Lebanon. Therefore, it has a lot to lose. If we were to get into another war with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and by the way, in 2006, we did not fight with Lebanon. We fought with Hezbollah on Lebanese soil, but we did not fight Lebanon. I think Hezbollah would have an awful lot to lose. And in my own cynical view of geopolitics, Hezbollah would have the most to lose if it were to rule Lebanon. If it were to rule Lebanon, then we could really deter it. It would have a lot to lose. It would also have a lot to gain by doing business with Israel. Notice the ongoing negotiations about the maritime issues between the two countries. There's a lot involved in terms of energy resources, pipelines, and so on and so forth. So I think that while my fellow Israelis are really unhappy, and rightly so, about Hariri bowing out and Hezbollah taking over gradually, but steadily, I'm not so worried about it. If they were to become the government of Lebanon, I think it would be easier to deal with them than it is now. I'm very traditional in that sense. I like to deal with organized states. I don't like mess. And I think that non-state organizations occupying territories as guerrilla organizations within states is a messy business. Also hurts your narrative and values and all that. So I think that Hezbollah taking over in Lebanon is just about inevitable, not only because of the Iranians, but because of the demography. Christians are leaving in droves. The Druze have their own territorial enclaves. They're not interested in taking over Lebanon. The Sunni Muslims are split between them and certainly are declining in numbers and in influence. So I think that some kind of Hezbollah domination of Lebanese politics in the, let's say, foreseeable future is just about inevitable. And I don't think we should see it as a tragedy.
John, you had another question, and then we'll open it up, and then I'll
Yeah.
deal with the questions.
Just a quick comment, Gabi. You know, I agree with you. The Abraham Accords, of course, were great for Israel, and I agree with your reasons. But the other reasons that the Abraham Accords came about were because the UAE got F-35s, Morocco got the Western Sahara, and Sudan got off the terrorist list. And I wonder if those three elements weren't involved, whether the Abraham Accords would have come about. And therefore, we get back to Mr. Trump. And secondly, whether we can expect to expand that list without such offers, that attractive offers that are included.
The answer is no. We cannot first of all, the accords would not have come to be without those goodies being offered on the table. And second, for that reason, they will not be expanded either. It's too big for Israel alone. No matter how good we are and how innovative we are, how great our technology is, in and of itself, it's not enticing enough for these countries to stop towing the traditional Arab line. It needs the invention of a great power like the United States to bring about dramatic changes in geopolitical perception. Even if we go back to the biggest events of the past along such lines, say the peace treaty with Egypt. The initiative came from the Egyptians and the Israelis, and Norwegians were involved, and Romanians were involved, and Moroccans were involved. Where was the treaty signed? On the lawn of the White House. Without American involvement and leadership, it would not have come to be. Likewise, the Abraham Accords, and it will not be expanded either without the momentum being revived by a more active American involvement. We could not offer them the goodies. We could not offer them F-35s because we don't have them. We could not get Sudan off the terrorist list, and we could not give the Western Sahara to Morocco. We don't carry the geopolitical clout for that kind of candies being, in the store for the kids.
Thank you. Let me. We have a number of questions from our participants, Gabby, and I'm going to get to those questions, and I'll do a number of them together, and then I'll turn it over to you. Barbara Landau has asked a number of questions, and I think Barbara, if I may, your first question I think was dealt with when John Allen asked basically the same question, and Gabby dealt with it. So I'll go to your other questions as well. So you asked, and I'll just read the question entirely. Israel's focused on security, but what are issues where it can build real security? For example, in other words, cooperation on climate issues, improving people's lives by ending repressive measures and building hope, ending home demolitions, and ensuring water, jobs, and goods. That is, build security by dealing fairly and justly with the Palestinians. And a further question for Barbara Landau: how does it help Israeli security to undermine and delegitimize Abu Mazen, pushing young Palestinians into the hands of Hamas, not because they want violence, but because the PLO has no confidence in a similar situation to 2006? Two more questions, and then I'll turn it over to you. An anonymous attendee asked, does the BDS movement against Israel have any impact or significance vis-a-vis Israel's national security? And Amnon Zohar asks, why or why not should Israel and the Sunni Arab nations, including the Palestinians, form a Middle East union modeled after the EU with freedom of movement for work, study, travel, and trade? There you go.
Okay. I'm tempted to say yes to all the questions. I am for human rights. I'm against repressive measures. And I also believe that the right way to handle national security, as I pointed out in my very introductory remarks, what is national security? Is a threat to which you need to respond. And the best way to deal with that threat is to reduce it, and if possible, to eliminate it. So the best thing for Israeli security would be if nobody would threaten us. And I think if we can do it diplomatically or by gaining the goodwill of the people involved, so much the better. I'm all for diplomacy and less for military. However, the possibilities are limited for the reasons we have just now mentioned. In terms of the Palestinians, let's not beat around the bush. There is a historical tragedy involved here. Two nationalist movements of two peoples for the same piece of territory. Both parties can claim, with good reasons, justice on their side, and rights on their side, and history on their side, and tradition on their side, and so on and so forth. And the only solution would be a decent compromise. We don't have the decent compromise, and I don't want to get again into historical arguments who rejected what particular situation or what particular set. We Israelis see ourselves as the rightful occupants of at least much of the land. We wanted to make peace in the past. They didn't want to make peace, they attacked us, but that's the Israeli perception with a good deal of justice. The Palestinians have their own narrative. I don't want to argue now about the Palestinian narrative. I want to say that the right thing to do is look for a decent compromise. There have been any number of compromise solutions being put on the table, most recently by Barak and Ehud Olmert just 15 years ago, which would have given the Palestinians more or less the 67 bordered states with a few compromises, perhaps with a sharing of parts of Jerusalem, and there were decent proposals totally rejected out of hand by the same Arafat that people adored at the time, and also by Abu Mazen, who is now in power. Are we trying to delegitimize Abu Mazen? I'm not sure. The present government has its number 3 man, the Minister of Defense, Benjamin Gantz, my former student, former graduate student, hosting Abu Mazen in his villa in Ra'anana, and visiting Abu Mazen in Ramallah, and offering also all sorts of concessions on daily life, on supervision of the territories, freer movement of people to work in Israel. So, I mean, things are being done, and they're not dramatic and they're not revolutionary, but I don't think we're trying to delegitimize Abu Mazen. What's in it for us? I mean, we don't want Hamas to take over. So we have something in common with Abu Mazen. But Abu Mazen is an old man, losing his momentum, losing his legitimacy. He hasn't been elected for 15 years or so. He projects an image of lethargy and corruption. And I don't think he is the type of leader that we need, like a Sadat, who can come and make major concessions and say, okay, let's make peace on the basis of historical compromise. So that's, I think, the present situation. I think we'll have to live with that for a while. And I think there is the theory of William Zartman called the right moment. Certain initiatives which make sense won't succeed unless you make them at the right time. When the circumstances are right, and when the initiative has a chance to succeed. So we can shout peace from the rooftops anytime, but you need the right partner and the right support and the right circumstances and the right regional realities to bring them about. And it's very hard to make revolutionary progress under the present constraints in the Middle East. As I said, one key factor would be a renewed American momentum in the region, which might change it all and which might carry the Abraham Accords to another place. And why am I talking about the Abraham Accords within the Palestinian paradigm? Because that was part of the assumption of the UAE leaders and the other Arabs involved, that they are not betraying the Palestinians, but they are creating the better conditions for bringing about a possible solution to the Palestinian problem when Israel doesn't feel threatened, doesn't feel insecure, doesn't feel obsessive with military security. And I think that was good thinking. But if the Abraham Accords cannot flourish, cannot expand, cannot show themselves to succeed, then we are not creating the right climate for resolving the Palestinian issue either.
Gabby, maybe you could just make some quick comments on the question regarding the BDS.
BDS.
And also the question about the idea of a Middle East Union.
Well, the Middle East Union would be really expanding the Abraham Accords and getting the other Arab countries involved. And look at the problems. First of all, as I said, the Palestinians rejected the initiative out of hand. And they still condemn them. Secondly, even the Egyptians who have a formal peace agreement with Israel were unhappy with the Abraham Accords. Why? For their own geopolitical reasons. They wanted to be the ones who carried the torch for the Arabs. And they were the ones who told the other Arabs, we are strong, we made peace with Israel, and therefore we can deliver the goods to you. You want progress on the Palestinian front, we can negotiate with Israel. Tell us, we'll take the message to Tel Aviv, as they put it. Now that the UAE deals directly, not with Tel Aviv, but Jerusalem, the Egyptians are unhappy. Okay, and the Jordanians are unhappy because they wanted to be the torch carriers. They wanted to be the ones who would always be acknowledged as the pioneers, who at the same time dictated the constraints. You make peace with Israel, but you don't normalize. And here comes the UAE, says, we don't need peace because we had no war, but we want to normalize. So even within the Arab world, there is no consensus about the type of union you're talking about. I don't want to be a cynical historian, but I am a historian of sorts. It took the Europeans a very long time to get to this point. I mean, you can go back to the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia, 1618, 1648, and the many, many wars between Germany and France, and the greatest disruption in modern human history, World War II, which brought about the recognition in Europe that things have to change in this direction. We are not there yet in the Middle East. And so I think that the right moment has not yet arrived. As for the BDS, I see the BDS as a serious enemy. It hasn't caused too much damage yet, but it might. If we believe, as I do, that the struggle for the narrative is a big part of Israeli national security, then the BDS is a formidable enemy undermining our legitimacy around the world. And why am I saying this? Because at the present moment, for example, let's leave North America aside for a moment. Let's look at Western Europe. Israel has decent relations with practically every major European leader, be it Boris Johnson in the UK or President Macron in France, the outgoing and incoming chancellor in Germany. Everything is fine. They are with us, but public opinion isn't. Students on campus are not. Trade unions are not. Artists and journalists are not. Much of the intellectual community is not. And many times when we talk to these leaders, that's what they tell us. We would like to do more for you, but our public opinion won't let us, because it considers you to be all the things that you have said: repressive, oppressive, colonialist, and so on and so forth. And I think that therefore the BDS has to be confronted on its own terms. I mean, we have to tell our story, we have to strengthen our narrative, we have to go on the offensive, and we have to be much more open-minded, and we have to be much more courageous on that. Let me give you an example. You might remember the incident with Judge Goldstone, okay, and his famous commission of inquiry. At the time, they made a strategic decision not to cooperate and try to discredit the commission. Commission eventually released its report, which was very damaging from the Israeli point of view. Later on, Judge Goldstone said, whether or not, honestly, I don't know, but with seeming candidness, that had he known all the things that he now knows, he wouldn't have signed the report, so he would not have initiated the report. So I think this kind of Israeli policy not to cooperate with committees of this kind, but you have to say, you are hostile, you have bad intentions, we are leaving the scene. That might be a partial mistake. In some cases, it would be better to go into a battle which you lose, but you know that you will lose nobly. You will make your case, the case will be heard around the world. You will have a good conscience, telling the truth as you see it. And if the commission is biased, everybody will see it's biased. And everybody will not see it. At least you have made an honest effort to make your point of view openly, candidly. Also admit mistakes when you make them. For example, in our handling of the Turkish ship, the Marmara, over 10 years ago, we made some mistakes. And then we were held to account by various international commissions, at the end of which the International Court in The Hague said, but look, according to our charter, we can intervene only if somebody tells us that the Israeli judicial system didn't handle it, and didn't handle it candidly and correctly according to the standards of international law. But Israel has a very strong judiciary system, and it came up before a commission of inquiry within Israel, headed by a Supreme Court justice, which looked into the matter and made some criticisms of the Israeli policies. And therefore, from our point of view, the case is closed. So I think we should address these issues honestly and openly, not shy away from them, and not to leave the arena to hostile forces like BDS. And that's why I said I think we are losing the narrative, because we're not addressing it energetically enough, aggressively enough, and openly enough. It's a sensitive set of issues we're involved in. As I said, two nationalist movements fighting for the same piece of land. Fighting is messy, fighting is dirty, people get killed, territory is taken, people get oppressed. Many things are done which are unjust. This is unfortunately the reality of war. When we make a mistake, we should admit it, but we should stick up proudly for the basic justice of our cause. As far as Har's point is concerned, on that one sense, on that one front, on one arena of the Palestinian issue being the central without which nobody can make a movement, we indeed have made progress, and you might say we have won the narrative. The narrative is now that in the Middle East, the heart of the problem is not Israel, but Iran. Israel is not part of the problem, but part of the solution. And the Palestinians, unfortunately, are bothersome because they won't let the Arabs and Israel do honest business in order to contain Iran.
Thank you. Yeah, one final question here, which isn't directly related to, I don't think, national security, but I'm going to read it anyway and see if you have any sort of final last comment, and then we'll bring it to a close. What can be done in the diaspora and in Israel to educate the next generation, including visits by our Jewish community to the West Bank to build better understanding, and reciprocally to create exchanges, inviting Palestinian young people to learn about us here and in Israel? Do you have any thoughts about that? And then
yes, I do. I think that these are good ideas. And I think that the best thing we can do with diaspora Jews and the young generation is indeed simply bring them to Israel and see what Israel is like. With all its faults, with all its problems, with sometimes all its mistakes, of which we have made many, Israel is a good thing. It's an inspiring thing. And I think that people who come here basically go home convinced that this is something they need to support, something that they want to be involved in, something that they basically sympathize with, notwithstanding everything bad that they may have seen. Palestinians, likewise. I mean, Palestinians who visit Israel, basically, okay, let me just end with this note. I was involved between 1993, Oslo, and 2000, the second Intifada, in 22 meetings with Palestinians, Palestinian intellectuals, one of whom is the Palestinian Prime Minister today, Muhammad Ashtaya. I hate to say a friend of mine. In European cities, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and Harvard University, in which we try to work out these problems of the narrative and agreement. We made no progress on the narrative whatsoever, but we made a lot of progress on other issues. And the Palestinians used to say, well, you have not convinced us of the narrative that there is a Jewish people which have rights in the land of Israel, Palestine, blah, blah. But you have convinced us that we need to live together, and there are some practical issues on which we can agree. So let's talk about boundaries, how to resolve the refugee issues, what to do about Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. And I think we need to discuss these issues. And I think that when we discuss them openly, we find very impressive and sometimes surprising things. For example, my Palestinian intermediaries used to say, well, we hate your guts for having taken our land and oppressed our people, but we would like to be like you, an open society, a liberal democracy, with free votes, freedom of speech, and so on and so forth. So even though you did all these wrong things, you're a good example for us. What we should be like if we want to make progress in this world. I think that's the spirit in which we can make progress. And I think that when it's a people-to-people kind of encounter, it builds up trust for the future. But let's not be naive. It won't do away with the fundamental ideological differences, and it won't overcome the practical problems between the two governments. But it can build up a reservoir of goodwill and confidence and some kind of mutual trust for changing the climate. And I come back once again to the right moment theory, when the moment will be right for the next step to expand normalization and peace in the Middle East.
With that note, I think that was a wonderful note on which to end. And I want to thank you, Gabby, for being with us, for taking the time to be with us this evening in Israel. And I want to thank all of the participants. And I'll now turn it over to, I think, Rabbi Goodman to close it out and to give thanks. Rabbi Goodman.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again. Thank you, Professor, for being with us. Thank you to the experts on screen with us. And thank you to everyone who joined us online, who is either with us in real time or joining us to watch the recording later. Another special word of gratitude to Helena and David Fine, whose generous gift of sponsorship has allowed this series to take place. So we will be joining together again next week. Let me just make sure that we're meeting on, everyone has the appropriate date. I know we're some on Thursday, some on Friday. So next week will be on February 4th. Well, we'll start talking about Iran and unpacking some of the pieces that, Gabby, that you introduced for us to think about over the week. So just another quick reminder, readings can be found on the Holy Blossom website. I'll also make sure that I attach them in the emails to you. But if you'd like to read ahead of time, more than in 24 hours notice or so, a Google Drive folder can be found on the Holy Blossom website, as well as the recordings of previous sessions. So thank you everyone again for your time. Thank you for this intriguing, thoughtful conversation, and we will join together next week. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Gabby.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.
Thank you,
Okay.
Gabby.
Okay.
Terrific.
Have a pleasant afternoon.
And when you have a chance, just send me your
Yes.
your PowerPoint, and I'll just get it
Will
over
do.
to Rabbi.
Will do.
Shabbat shalom.